So let's get started. Thank you everybody for attending today's session. It's a pleasure to introduce Josh Rackers. Dr. Rackers is a Truman Fellow at Sandia National Laboratory, where he studies how to do quantum accurate simulations of biological molecules. And prior to joining Sandia, Josh obtained a PhD in biophysics from Washington University in St. Louis. He grew up in Ohio and attended Ohio State University, where he majored in physics and political science. He spent then 3 years teaching high school physics and chemistry in Baltimore, Maryland, and before ultimately heading back into research. And the experience of teaching actually has stuck with Josh, and personally and professionally, and he's passionate about his work, not only because it's scientific potential, but also because it's accessible to anyone who wants to use physics to understand the biological world. So with no further ado, I will let Dr. Rackers move forward with his talk about progress and development of higher order methods, if I'm not mistaken, and AFC correction in continuous film schemes application to plasma continuum. I don't think that this is the right title. Oh yeah, combining physics and AI to understand the behavior of molecules. I was a little bit confused. Sorry.
Okay. No, you're good. You're good. Thanks for the introduction. I appreciate it. Like Anthony said, my name is Josh Rackers, and I'm really excited to be here. I have never been to San Diego State before, and as much as I wish I could be there in person, given all of your beautiful Zoom backgrounds, it's great to be able to present virtually. So today I'd like to sort of split my seminar into two parts. The first part, which will be the shorter part, will be dedicated to sort of like a get to know you sort of thing. And that'll be both getting to know me personally and also, more importantly, getting to know the sort of national lab complex, the Department of Energy National Labs. Because one of the goals of this is for the students or postdocs that are attending to kind of put the idea of a national lab on your radar. And then, of course, the second part of the talk will be the meat of the science, which is my work as a Truman Fellow. And I'm hoping, given the broad range of expertise I expect in the seminar today, that will generate some interesting questions. So in general, you should feel free to interrupt me at any point in time, given that this is a diverse set of perspectives that I'm sure people are bringing. If I am sounding too much like a physicist, you can stop me and ask me to explain. If I'm sounding too much like a biologist, you can feel free to do the same. So yeah, so let's start with the first part. So yeah, who am I? I didn't always know that I wanted to be a scientist. I grew up in Ohio, and I went to Ohio State University for my undergrad, and majored in physics and political philosophy, and really didn't know if I wanted to go into science full time whenever I graduated from undergrad. And so I decided to take a little bit of a different path and do a program called Teach for America, which places new college graduates in mostly urban and all poor schools across America. And I happened to be placed in Baltimore, Maryland, where I taught high school physics and chemistry for 3 years. And in many ways, that experience has really stuck with me. And in fact, that experience is what kind of drove me back into academia. So this is a picture of my very last class of graduating students from the school that I taught at, called the Seed School of Maryland. And I should say this is half of the class. This is the boys in the class. The story is about this young man, Christian, down here in the corner. So he was always sort of a character, probably is still a character. I haven't talked to him in a long time. But you know, one day we're in class and Christian raises his hand out of nowhere, and I assume he's going to ask a question about the work. And I'm very excited about that because I need him to pay attention to the work. And he goes, Mr. Rackers? I go, yeah. And he goes, you're always telling us that we should care about physics because, it really matters to problems in the real world, right? And I go, yeah, I do say that, Christian. And he goes, why don't you do that? And that question really sort of like hit me straight in the heart. And I'm sure at the time I said something really inspiring, like, go do your work or something like that. But the question did stick with me. And ultimately, that idea of wanting to do something where we can use physics to understand the world around us is what drove me back to graduate school. So then after teaching, I got a PhD in biophysics from Washington University in St. Louis. And then after finishing that, I started as a Truman Fellow here at Sandia National Labs in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And that's a good segue to talk about what the national labs are. So the next several slides are just sort of general information about the national labs. So national labs are, I think, a good place to pursue science because they're places that tackle big and challenging problems. So if you're interested, if you're a student or postdoc and interested in doing these sorts of things, then the national labs are definitely something to put on your radar. One thing that we all need to do science is funding. And the national labs, particularly through the Department of Energy, do okay whenever it comes to funding. So the Department of Energy is the biggest single funder of science in the United States. And you can sort of see the breakdown in different colors here. And the point of this graph is to show you two things. The first is that this bar for the Department of Energy is bigger than any of the other bars, and that this is a very large number of dollars. But the second thing is that it's actually a quite diverse set of things that the Department of Energy funds in the scientific realm. It's not just things related to what you would think of as stock and trade of the Department of Energy. So the Department of Energy does a big range of things and funds a big range of science. And as sort of historical evidence of that, I guess you'll say, this is kind of a like nice little list of important discoveries or innovations that were produced at Department of Energy National Labs. You can sort of look through the list here. There's some very impressive and kind of fun things that have come out of DOE National Lab research. My personal favorite is the Human Genome Project. Actually originated as a Department of Energy project, which is kind of fascinating. And of course, there are many, many other labs besides the one that I sit at. So I sit at Sandia National Laboratories, which is here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. But there are many other national labs scattered across the country. And you can sort of see where they are on a map right here. And these labs, although all of them do science, they have different persuasions, as you can probably imagine. So this sort of schematic shows where the labs fit on how they see themselves as doing science. Now, of course, all of this is subject to, all of these labs are enormous places. So you can see that Sandia National Labs is over here on the technology end of the spectrum, but you'll see that the research that I do, even though I am a scientist at Sandia, skews further towards the science side of the spectrum. And the same could probably be said of people who skew the other way at other national labs. The point being here that they're all most of them are very large places with lots of different science going on. So it's worth exploring that. And of course, if you're interested, if you're a student and want to do an internship, virtually all the labs have internship programs. Unfortunately, there's not some centralized place to apply for internships, but each of them have a pretty easy to navigate internship kind of portal. And if you'd like to talk to me about your own interests and would like to know more about where it would be good to do an internship or how you could get in contact with someone to do an internship, I'd of course be happy to answer any questions about that. So that's just sort of at a broad level what the national labs are. And in all honesty, I'm not the most qualified person to talk about that, given that I've only been at a national lab for 1.5 years. But what I can talk about with a fair amount of knowledge is the fellowships that all of the national labs have. So I have a postdoc fellowship called the Truman Fellowship, and all of the national labs, or almost all the national labs, have a fellowship like it, where it's independent funding for some set period of time, usually 2 or 3 years, to work on any scientific project that you'd like. It's more or less an independent grant for a postdoc to do their own research. And these are really a good thing. If you have the opportunity to apply for these or have ideas that you think would be interesting to explore on your own, you should definitely apply to either the Truman or one of the other ones that are at the other national labs. It's been a really excellent experience for me to get to explore my own research direction, and they're just a great way to become a sort of independent scientist. Okay, so I'll pause there before I go into the science part and ask, are there any questions about the national labs generally, or what fellowships are like, or what internships are like? Any questions on that? I see someone has their hand up, but I can only see that it's a B. Someone's name started with a B.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for that. I was wondering how you keep track of your independent research to obviously let them know that you're continuing on, right? So do you keep journals or?
Excuse me. Yeah, that's a good question. That happens in 2 ways. The first is that I publish papers, and that's the main thing that the lab cares about, to show that you're being productive. But the other is that I give yearly internal review presentations where I present on all of my work, whether it's been published or not. So those are the two main ways that they sort of keep track to make sure that you're progressing and doing good science. And even in all of the fellowships, mine included, have some mentorship component. So I have 3 mentors at Sandia, and all of them are invested in making sure that my projects are progressing. All right. If there are no other questions about the career side of things, let's go into the science. Okay, so I think about the science that I do within the context of what I call the grand challenge of molecular science, or equivalently, the grand challenge of biophysics, if you're biologically persuaded. And the grand challenge of molecular science goes something like this. It just says, can we predict from first principles the behavior of molecules at the atomic scale? So to give this some concrete example, this is a schematic of the coronavirus spike protein, which it seems like the whole country has become experts in. And the question as it's applied to this is, could we predict how this molecule is going to move, fold, interact with other molecules just from first principles? And you know, that might sound like kind of comically impossible, right? This has like 100,000 atoms in it, and all of those atoms are interacting with each other. But from a physics point of view, this is, or at least it should be, a solvable problem. And that is to say, we know all of the ingredients that are necessary to solve this problem. We know F equals ma, of course, which says that if I know the force on any atom, I know how it will move. And we know how to get those forces, which is namely from Schrodinger's equation, right? We find out where the electrons are. Now, of course, the difficult problem here is this part. It's solving Schrodinger's equation. This is the part that makes the grand challenge of molecular science very challenging. It's hard to solve Schrodinger's equation for large systems. And so I I'd like to first, before I go into how we're going to take a little chunk out of that grand challenge today, just give you a little outline of where the talk's going to go. So the first part, introduction, we've already done. We're going to talk about what makes the grand challenge hard. So why is that grand challenge really difficult? And then I'm going to talk about the way that I have sort of come up with for trying to address that. And that's using machine learning to predict molecular electron densities. I'll introduce you to what Euclidean neural networks are, if you're not already familiar with them, and explore whether they're capable of learning quantum mechanics. And then what I'll share with you in the second part is how we can add physics to that neural network model, and why adding that physics is essential to tackling this question of, can we do large scale simulations? And then of course, I'll show you results on actual calculations that I've done, and then share some outlook at the end. Okay, so I said multiple times that solving Schrodinger's equation is a hard problem. Why is it a hard problem? The short answer is we do know how to solve it. It's just that whenever we try to solve it on a computer, the scaling scales horrendously. So this is a little kind of cute example, and it shows the amount of time that it takes to solve Schrodinger's equation to get a wave function, or equivalently an electron density, for systems of increasing size. So this is how much time it would take for 1 water molecule, 2 water molecules, 4 water molecules, 6 water molecules, so on and so forth. What you can see is that for small numbers of atoms, this is relatively reasonable. Doing a calculation on this 6 water thing only took about an hour. But the slope of this curve is terrible. If you wanted to do the same calculations for 50 atoms, right, so to go out here, that calculation would take about 2 months. And for 100 atoms, that would take about 20 years. And that means that if we want to do something like the coronavirus spike protein, which has 100,000 atoms, that's going to be a very tall order. And you might say, okay, well, yeah, you did those calculations on your laptop, and laptops are, not the best thing that you could do. And I would like to stress to you that even if you had the most powerful supercomputer in the world, and you had 1,000 of them, if you had 1,000,000 of them, you wouldn't be able to do this. And let me just show you what I mean. If this dot to scale is the computational power of my laptop, this is the computational power of the Summit supercomputer, which I think at this point is now the second fastest supercomputer in the world. So as a member of the National Lab, you can apply to run things on this enormous supercomputer. And for that example I gave on the last slide, 100 atoms, if you divide by the number of processors in Summit, you get down to being able to do a calculation in about 6 minutes. You might say, oh, well, that's not so bad anymore. Now we can just build a really big computer and we can do our calculations. But because of the scaling of this, if we wanted to do 100,000 atoms, that would take 42 ages of the universe, even on the Summit supercomputer. And so what I'd really like to stress here is that this is not a problem of just needing to build a bigger computer. Because quantum algorithms on classical computers scale horrendously, you will never be able to do this sort of calculation without some sort of clever way of getting around it. And so here's my idea of my clever way of getting around it. So this is how you would typically think of doing a quantum calculation. You take some set of input coordinates of the system that you're interested in, you feed it through your algorithm, and it gives you an electron density. What I'd like to do is to bypass that expensive calculation with a neural network. And just to make sure that we're all on the same page here, the reason to do this is that neural networks don't suffer from the same size scaling problem that, that quantum chemistry methods do. They scale linearly given certain provisos about the network. And that means, that you actually do have a shot of doing a calculation that is as big as a coronavirus spike protein, or any other large molecule for that matter. Okay. So I'm sure that being a computational science department, you're quite familiar with someone who's a domain expert in something else coming along and saying, well, why don't we just use machine learning on this? And I'm going to hopefully try to convince you today that that's not the case here, that we have some really good tricks up our sleeve to give us a reason to believe that we're not just throwing a convolutional neural network at this. We're going to actually do some real science. And to sort of stress why I think that this is needed, why you can't just use traditional neural network architecture, I'd like to kind of lay out why this problem is slightly different than a lot of use cases in machine learning. So first of all, learning Schrodinger's equation is not something humans do well already, right? It's not recognizing cars or bikes. It's not playing Go. And in fact, it's not something that we even already know the answer to. Some of you may have seen that there was a recent success of AI in predicting the structure of folded proteins. DeepMind built an AI algorithm that was capable of predicting the structure of folded proteins based on the structures of other folded proteins. What I think is that this problem, as I laid it out here, is actually harder than any of these examples that I put over here on the left. And that's because for large systems, we don't know what the answer is. We do not know how to calculate the electronic structure of something like a large molecule. We just know that it's possible to do so because, of course, it has an electronic structure, and it must exist. So in that way, what we're doing here is a little bit different than a typical use case of machine learning. We're trying to access something that we won't have a way of knowing, at least theoretically, is exactly right. So if we're going to tackle this task, I think that there are two big questions that have to be answered by whatever method that one's going to use to tackle this. The first question is simple. It's, can a machine learning model learn quantum mechanics? You know, quantum mechanics is complicated. That's why the scaling of quantum chemistry algorithms is so high. And what I'd like to suggest is that the answer to this is yes, if we use a specialized type of neural network, called Euclidean neural networks. And then the second question is, can a machine learning model extrapolate? And this question is essential, and I need a better way of phrasing this. So let me give it by example. I want to know, can I train a machine learning model on examples that are small and expect equivalent performance, equivalent accuracy on samples that are large? And by small and large here, I just mean by number of atoms. And I think, although I won't say as categorically as with the first one, likely, yes, we can do that, but only if we build in physics into our model. So let me kind of sketch out where those answers are coming from. So I've said we're going to use a Euclidean neural network for this task, and I'd like to sort of, at a high level, describe what a Euclidean neural network is. So a Euclidean neural network is meant to operate in three-dimensional space, and it's essentially a convolutional neural network. I'm sure many of you in the audience are familiar with what convolutional neural networks are, but just to give kind of an explanation, convolutional neural networks work by encoding locality into the model. So in this example here, you have a filter, and this filter is passed over every element of the input image. And it translates some neighborhood values onto each pixel. And then those convolved features are then put through a neural network, and then you attempt to predict something at the end, like, is this a 2 or not? One feature, unfortunately, that convolutional neural networks in this format that I just set here do not have is called equivariance. In other words, if I take this input and I rotate it, the network doesn't necessarily know that this is the same thing. And this is a property that we would really, really like to have for anything that is going to need to do learning in three-dimensional space. And for this is what Euclidean neural networks are built to do. So Euclidean neural networks, and I use an implementation called E3NN, but there are others out there, have this property of equivariance built in, where they're equivariant to rotations. And to sort of explain equivariance, let me give an example. Say that I have a training example in my training data of this box of water atoms. And let's say that, yeah, I have my filter here and I want to pass it over all the atoms in my box. And one of the outputs that I'd like to predict is some vector on this oxygen atom, say it's a force. If I take this example and I rotate it by some rotation matrix, I would like my neural network to rotate the output of its output by exactly the same rotation matrix. And I'd like to stress that a conventional neural network, most conventional neural networks do not have this property. You need a special property, the special property of equivariance, in order to have this. This is especially important if we want to learn quantum mechanics, because of course the output of quantum mechanics is a three-dimensional object, right? The electron density. So if I want to use this as a training example, right? So these atoms producing this electron density, I don't want my neural network to have to learn that this is an equivalent example. I want it to have that property built in. I want it to know that this is just a rotated version of this same sample. And the reason we care about that is because doing quantum mechanics calculations is very resource intensive. And estimates are that it takes something on the order of 100 times more data if you don't have equivariance in order to adequately train a model in 3 dimensions. And to sort of show how this equivariance works, my friend Tess did a really nice little demonstration of equivariance. What she did is she trained a E3NN model to predict the names of the shapes on the top here, these different Tetris blocks. And then she rotated all of those Tetris blocks by random rotation matrices and tested the network on those rotated versions. And what she found was the expected behavior, that the test set error was exactly equal to the training set error. In other words, the network really does not care which orientation any of these are in. And the way that E3NN is able to achieve this is by having features that are a little bit different than your typical neural network. In a typical neural network, features are represented as scalars, and the magnitude of that scalar tells you what the feature on a particular neuron is. In this type of neural network, features are actually represented as combinations of spherical harmonics. So this is a little abstract, but the spherical harmonics are representations of 3-dimensional space. So you start here with the L equals 0, which is just spherically symmetric. And then as you add higher and higher L representations, you get things that represent the anisotropy of some distribution at a site. And what is really neat about this, in addition to these features bestowing equivariance on the network, is that these spherical harmonics are exactly the way that we represent electron densities. So if there are any quantum chemists in the audience, the way that we represent an electron density, of course, is with a basis set. And a basis set is nothing else than a combination of spherical harmonics. So what's neat about this is that the data type that is representing the features of our neural network is exactly the same as the data type of the thing that we're trying to predict. Okay, second, so that addressed the question of what kind of architecture would we need to do machine learning for quantum mechanics. The second question I'd like to address is, how do we have any idea of whether a deep learning model or machine learning model can extrapolate? And again, extrapolation is this idea that we can train on small things and predict on big. So let me give an example here. This is a protein that occurs naturally, and this protein has been studied by some folks that were looking at how mutations throughout the protein affect structure at a particular catalytic site. So this protein is a catalyst, and it catalyzes some reaction that I can't remember. But what they found is that they found mutations that are distant from this catalytic site that do affect the structure of the site itself. So if we wanted to build a model for this protein, we'd have to chop it up because we can't do a quantum calculation on something this big. This has way too many atoms to actually build a training set on. So we'd probably chop it up into sort of representative things, right? Interactions between, things that are next to each other or things that are touching each other across helices or something like that. And you would come up with some really clever scheme probably to break this into small representative chunks. There we go. The question is, can that strategy predict the actual behavior of this system? So in this system, what they found is that this site here is over 15 angstroms away from where this catalytic site is. And what the problem is that 15 angstroms is far too big to be included in any of these individual training points here. In other words, the training set over here imposes some effective radius. Whatever the biggest size of a training sample is over here, effectively sets how far that machine learning model can see. In other words, every machine learning model needs data, and it can't know anything outside of where that data is, what that data is telling it. So if the largest distance between interactions in your training set is 8 angstroms, then your model has an effective cutoff of 8 angstroms. And so this is a big problem because 15 angstroms in the world of quantum chemistry means that you would need a very, very large size of training example in order to effectively capture this interaction, which really does happen in nature. We see it right here in the experiments that these folks did. So what I'd like to stress is that if you just use data here, you can't solve this problem, right? If you have long-range interactions, you can't solve this problem without having data that directly includes those long-range interactions. Okay, so is there a way around this? And I think the answer is yes. Now, the way that I think that we can do this is that rather than learning, for instance, energies or forces directly, we can learn the electron density. And that means that we can learn the electron density in each of these areas. And yes, each of these electron densities, because we still have a training set, will be local functions. But these densities themselves are physical objects, and they can interact, right? These electron densities are allowed to interact with each other. And that means that even if my training set is not big enough to include interactions that are this far away, I can still get this interaction in my model. And that's because I explicitly include the physics of an electron density and allow that electron density to drive the dynamics of the model that I'm using here. So I think that's the key. That's the difference. That's the way to escape this trap of being bound by whatever the maximum size of training set calculation that you can do is. So with that, I'd like to move into discussing some results that I have. So unfortunately, I don't have anything as sophisticated as calculations on proteins, but what I do have is a really good model system in water. And water is a good model system because it's been studied the heck out of. People know a lot out of water, and there are really good databases of structures and quantum calculations on water. And it makes a nice test bed to test some of these ideas. So here's the first result that I'd like to share. Using Euclidean neural networks, it looks like you only need a very small amount of data to adequately train a network to predict electron density. So what I did in this example is I trained a neural network, an E3NN neural network on clusters of 8 water molecules, and then tested that model on a test set of 8 water molecules that were not included in, of course, not included in the training set. And what I see is that for any randomly chosen molecule from the test set, the densities are virtually indistinguishable. This is basically an eye test. And we can really see that if we drill down to the density difference map. So this is just these 2 densities subtracted from each other. What you can see is that the maximum error that we're getting in any point in the density, that includes the areas very close to the nuclei, which have very high densities, is 0.04 or negative 0.04 electrons. And for non-chemists in the audience, that is a very accurate level of detail whenever it comes to the electron density. And I'd like to just make the point here that this is, I think I said this already, on only 50 samples, right? So all that's needed is 50 samples to achieve this level of accuracy. Okay, so a different way to think about that, if you're not a chemist and you're not used to calibrated on what an average number of electrons means in terms of accuracy of a model, is a scalar comparison of densities. So in other words, if 0 here means that the densities have no overlap, they have no bearing on each other, they're not related at all, and 1 means that the densities are identical, we can measure as a scalar value how similar is the predicted density and the true density. And across the entire test set, for the set of 8 water molecules trained on 50 samples, you get a number that's very, very close to 1, 0.99964. And, you know, of course, I should say here that if you had a number down here, that would be nonsense, right? Because of course, densities have some inherent structure. They're going to be localized to atoms, and they're mostly spherical. So like, you know, getting something down here would be completely unphysical. But let it stand to say that this number of over 99% the same is roughly on the same order of error as very high level, the difference between very high level quantum computations. In other words, if you used a different quantum method to do the same calculation, the difference between those densities would be bigger than this number. And just as a quick aside, I'm not the first person to see this behavior of needing minimal data with Euclidean neural networks. So last year, the Gordon Bell Prize, which is a big supercomputing prize awarded to a group that does the best, makes the best use of a supercomputer, was awarded to DeepMD. And DeepMD is a model that predicted the molecular dynamics of energies and forces of giant quantities of water. And what they're doing is fundamentally different than what I'm interested in, because these are classical simulations, not quantum simulations. But what they were able to show is that they could get very good agreement with what their reference model was on these enormous systems, right? With, I can't remember exactly how many water molecules, but an enormous number. What my friend Simon did was he went back and looked at their data using a Euclidean neural network. And what he found was that he was able to get the same accuracy. This is published in, oh, I forgot to include the reference here, but if anyone's interested, I'd be happy to send it to you. What he found is that he could get the same accuracy as DeepMD on this data set, their exact same data set, with 1,000 fewer, order 1,000 fewer training examples, right? And that is sort of at the core of what Euclidean neural networks should be useful to do, right? They eliminate all the need for a neural network to learn equivariance, and they just have that symmetry of Euclidean space built in. And this is just a really powerful example of that in action. Okay, so that addresses the first question of how well Euclidean neural networks can learn this task. The second question is a little bit trickier, and I'm going to give you some data that I think supports it. So the question is, can Euclidean neural networks do this extrapolation thing where you train on small and predict on big? So I took the same model that I presented in the previous slides, trained on 8 water clusters, 50 samples, and I tested it on calculations with up to 30 water clusters, which is about almost as big as you can do with a regular computer. And what you'll see here is that the densities on these 30 water clusters are almost as similar as the densities were with clusters of 8. Again, in this density difference map, the differences are all within 0.04 to negative 0.04. And again, if we look at that scalar value is still 99%, over 99% similarity between the reference density on 30 water molecules and the machine learned density on 30 water molecules. And just to push this as far as I could to the limit, I got some time on a very big computer, not Summit, but another big computer here at the National Labs. And I did a calculation on 64 water molecules. And for this, I took the same model trained on 8 water molecules and predicted the density of this system and got a density similarity again above 99%, which again is on par or better than the difference between different quantum chemistry methods. So it really looks like here that we have some strong evidence that you can do this extrapolation task, that you can train on small things and make accurate predictions on large things. And of course, this is probably obvious, but the neural network method of doing these calculations scales much better than the quantum methods. So in red here is the amount of time that it took to do these quantum calculations up here to the 64. And in green is the amount of time that it takes the neural network to do this task. And you can see first that the scaling of the quantum method, that the scaling of the quantum methods goes up dramatically, and that the neural network scales linearly. And then of course the neural network is super fast compared to this. So the point here is that you could actually use this to do real science at the macro scale. You could do a quantum calculation on something super, super big and not and have that be feasible. Okay, so this is just about time for me to wrap it up for today. I'd like to end with 3 takeaways from today's talk. So the first is that I hope that I've stressed that current methods for quantum mechanics or quantum chemistry, at least on classical computers until quantum computers become a thing, will never be able to simulate a large biomolecule. That will never be computationally feasible. But there is, I think, a way around this kind of scaling barrier, and that's to use Euclidean neural networks. And I've sort of shown that Euclidean neural networks are capable of doing this task from very limited data. And then the last thing is that by using not just any output from a machine learning model, but in particular this physical quantity of the electron density, we're able to use physics to circumvent this extrapolation problem. In other words, we can train on small sized clusters and make predictions on large ones. And just to sort of like push this to kind of show you what's possible, this is a prediction that I just did the other day on 190 water molecules. So this is the same neural network that was shown before, that was trained on 50 samples of 8 water molecules. And the reason I pick 190 is that this is the first size of water cluster where it actually starts to act like real water, right? You couldn't see this under a microscope, of course, but this is the first cluster size where this starts to exhibit the sort of characteristics of a water droplet, right? This could conceivably fall from the sky and land on your car or something. What's really neat about this is that this prediction is in the range where it is nearly impossible for a classical computer to do this calculation, right? So we're accessing a realm of quantum mechanics that is impossible to access without the help of machine learning. And so where I'm taking this in the future is outside of the realm of just doing water, right? I said in the beginning, and I've said all along, that what we're interested in doing is biology. And so what I would like to do is to do something similar to this calculation, but for a biological molecule. In this example, DNA. And actually, I'm working with some folks at the University of New Mexico to do exactly that. So we're building a training set based on the segmenting up of a chunk of DNA. What we'd like to be able to show, or we'd like to be able to test, I should say, is whether we can actually make a prediction on this structure, which would be the first quantum prediction of an electron density of something this size. So with that, I'd like to thank my mentors here at Sandia, and I'd like to thank especially Lucas, who contributed, an intern with me, who contributed a bunch of data on the slides, Tess, who is the sort of godfather of Euclidean neural networks and developer of E3NN, along with Mario, and then Will, who's my collaborator at University of Mexico, who are working on extending this to biological molecules. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you for your attention and take any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Joshua, for this amazing talk. Do we have anyone with questions? I see some hands up, so we'll start in order as I see them. So Timothy Johnson, you go first.
Hi, first off, thanks. That was a really awesome presentation. My question is on how you encode the feature space. Earlier you said the features are combinations of spherical harmonics. I was hoping you could build on that a little bit more, because that does create, potential bottleneck on what types of molecules you could use this on.
Yes, so let me just clarify, what do you mean by potential bottleneck on types of molecules?
I guess bottleneck wasn't the right word, but if you apply, for example, standard like MLP, it's going to have a fixed input size, and that determines, how big the molecules can be and stuff like that. Got it.
Yeah, now I understand. So yeah, I don't have slides to show this, unfortunately, but I can briefly explain. E3NN, which is the implementation of Euclidean neural network that I use, operates as a graph neural network. So every atom is a node in the graph, and the messages that are passed between atoms are interactions between the spherical harmonic features on each atom. So there are special rules that you have to follow for how you combine, for instance, two vectors, right? You could do a dot product, or you could do a cross product, but you can't just sort of combine them willy-nilly. And so what makes E3NN special is that it enforces those rules in the message passing phase. Whenever you combine an L equals 2 spherical harmonic over here with an L equals 4 spherical harmonic over here, it enforces those rules when that message is passed, and that maintains equivariance throughout the network. So to answer the first part of your question, I imagine each node having a very long list of coefficients of spherical harmonics. So you might have 50 L equals 0, you might have 25 L equals 1, you might have 100 L equals 3. And all of those features are just sort of stacked there, and then combined with features on other atoms in this message passing phase of the neural network. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, thanks really much. It sounds kind of similar to a graph convolutional neural network, but I'm not sure.
Yes, it is. Sorry, it is a graph convolutional neural network with the extra layer of the imposing the rules for how spherical harmonics are combined, right? That's the thing that in a traditional convolutional graph neural network, you're just combining scalars, right? You pass it through an activation function, and then you pass that message to your neighboring atom. In E3NN, rather than just having a scalar be the input to that activation function, you have spherical harmonics, and that's the only thing that makes it conceptually different.
Very cool. Thank you.
No problem.
Next is Andrew Cooksey.
Hey, thank you very much. This was really fascinating. One of the things actually that's amazing about the water work is bringing the calculations to the point where we can do dynamics, right? Because the geometry of a single 190 water cluster isn't so interesting, because the whole point is that it's moving around all the time. And so if we can get to the point where we can do, 1,000 samples of that or something, that's like dynamics we've never been able to do. That's great. But I did want to ask, so as a computational chemist, the parameter of interest for me would more often be the energy. So do you have, could you explain the accuracy of the machine learning approach in terms of relative energies, for comparison?
Yeah, that is a great question. So let me start with forces. So although Forces can be difficult to calculate accurately from a scheme like this, but they can be calculated directly from the Hellman-Feynman theorem. So, of course, the Hellman-Feynman theorem says that given an electron density, you can calculate the force on any atom exactly by just using classical electrostatics, given that density is accurate enough. And so one of the things I'm working on right now is answering that question of, is the density that I'm working with here accurate enough to give accurate forces? Okay, so let's say that I can do that, and I'm fairly confident. I haven't shown data in this talk, but I'm fairly confident that that is achievable. The second question is, how do you get an energy? And that's actually surprisingly a little bit more complicated, because there's no direct way to get an energy directly from a density. You can get an energy from a wave function, but you can't get it directly from a density. What you can do is you can integrate the Hellman-Feynman theorem. In other words, if I have two structures that I want to know the relative energy difference between, if I know the forces on A and I know the forces on B, if I establish some path between A and B, and I integrate along that path, integrate the forces along that path, then that will give me the energy difference between A and B. So that's computationally tough to do, and I'm not exactly quite sure how to do that in a way that will give me numerically stable results, but it's conceptually possible. So that's my plan for computing energy differences.
Okay, that's great. And that's exactly what we would want, right, is relative energies between two states of the system. So yeah, if you can solve that, that would be beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, can you tell me what are the prospects for going from a kind of homogeneous system like the water to a heterogeneous system like the protein? Does that introduce new complications in the training? It seems like the dimensionality of the training is going to increase enormously.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. The dimensionality of the training will increase enormously. I think that what I'm learning from the water examples is that if you have that the sampling of interaction space can be relatively sparse, but you need at least one type of that interaction in your training set. And the same, I think, will hold true whenever it comes to more complex systems. So we may not need an entire molecular dynamics level worth of data in order to train a model for nucleic acids, for instance, but we will need to see every type of interaction that happens in the nucleic acid. We'll have to see stacking, we'll have to see ions interacting with the backbone, we'll have to see every sugar pucker that can occur on the backbone. So yeah, that gets complicated, but that's not insurmountable. I think that as long as we have a method, a systematic method for enumerating what all of those interactions can be for a system, and I think for nucleic acids and other biological molecules, that's relatively well understood, then we can build a training set that can do the task.
Oh, that's great. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Great questions.
So next we'll have Oliver Gorton.
Hi, thanks for your talk. So I guess maybe this question is related to Dr. Cooksey's. Could you elaborate on why you are modeling the electron density and why, or if it would be, could you reformulate this in a way to actually generate the wave function, which seems it would be more useful?
Yeah, that's a good question. The reason to generate a density over a wave function is not I won't say it's dogmatic. I would be equally interested in a model that learned the wave function. I think that one strong argument for learning the density is that you reduce the dimensionality of the thing that you need to learn, right? Mm-hmm. And you're one step closer to the end output that you want, which is forces and energies. So if you were to learn a wave function conceivably, and you wanted to do dynamics, you would have to go through a density to get there. Although I guess you could come up with a way to take derivatives of the energy and get forces that way. So that might be a promising way to go. But yeah, the short answer is it's a leaner approach. is learning a quantity that is more compressed.
I see. Thanks.
Next is a question that I got through the chat. I'm gonna give the chance to ask it. Joe Helmers.
So I'm just curious. I think you've answered this in a sense a little bit. I was curious about some of the details of the kinds of changes you're going to need to make as you look at other atoms. You know, because right now we looked at basically hydrogen and oxygen, and as you start looking at carbons and other things, how does that affect? What do you have to change in order to start doing those?
Yeah, good question. So I'll give two parts to that answer. The first part is that one of the things that makes me confident that we will be able to make that leap is that the input to the neural network is actually encoding the Coulomb interaction of atoms. So the network, for instance, knows that the interaction that's driving the formation of electron density is 1 over r, where z is an explicit part of that. So for a new atom, that'll change. The second thing is just empirical, is that there are lots of folks working in this quantum chemistry for, oh, sorry, excuse me, 1 second. Hi, Charlie. You have to go back downstairs, okay? Yeah, because I have to finish talking to my friends, okay?
But I want to stay with you.
Okay, do you want to sit on my lap and be quiet?
I'm going to stay on the bed and just jump.
No, you're not going to. Charlie.
Come here right now.
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Okay, so oh, the joys of working from home life.
Charlie's in trouble.
I'm in trouble. Oh yeah, train of thought back. There are lots of folks working on this problem, and lots of folks have put a lot of thought into how do you enumerate sort of chemical compound space. In other words, what are all the possible ways that an atom could interact with other atoms? And that expertise is something that and those databases are something that I plan to use liberally, because people have already sort of started to think about this problem in quite a bit of detail.
Good. So I have a question myself. It probably relates a little bit with what Andy Cooksey was asking before. I'm also work more on the biological side, and I was very intrigued on the dynamic aspect of it, how far you could go. But the most fundamental question that I had is, when you have these densities, for example, in these water molecules, when you're solving this Schrodinger equation, you're getting your density on the stationary state. Is that correct?
That's right. I should say this is the ground state density.
I see. And so then, have you considered semi-classical approaches to speed up the issues that you mentioned on having to use these densities to calculate the forces or the energies? But you're already doing this long-range interaction through the physics that you will have with the Coulomb. But have you thought about maybe how to incorporate the motion that you would expect, the thermal motion that you would expect from these, and also the deprotonations or some chemical aspects that maybe there is so much done there with density functional theory and other approaches that you could benefit? So have you explored any of those yet?
Yeah, good question. The short answer is I have not explored them yet, but there are a couple of different ways that I'd like to take that in the future, which I think would be really interesting. The first is learning excited states. So there's nothing that prevents you from using the same methodology to predict the transition densities for excited states, which would be a really interesting thing to study. But then the second thing is really trying to do a very thorough study of how accurate the forces from this model are. So like I alluded to before, it's not something that I can give a definitive answer to yet, but calculating forces from this density and actually doing dynamics, right? Running a simulation, playing a movie of this water droplet would be really compelling, right? Because what that would allow us to do is to understand how good a particular level of quantum theory is in bulk, right? Imagine that you wanted to understand how good, for instance, coupled cluster, which is the like so-called gold standard of quantum chemistry. Imagine you wanted to know what that theory, what results that gives for some bulk simulation, be that water or something else. That's the key question that I really want to answer in the future is how good are the forces that that this model can produce, and specifically, does it make a difference that you're getting this long range contribution in? So like in this water droplet, the long range contribution may not be very big, but in a system like this, where you have ions and you have long range folding effects that happen and that sort of thing, then we will really understand whether those long range effects matter.
I see. And I'm checking if there is any other question. If not, I will ask you a second question. So sure. In the biology chemistry side, actually, I was wondering a problem that is more static that I was wondering if you have thought about it is, for example, on the coordination with metals. And that can provide, you might have a technology that might be able to provide a solution already if you compare a catalytic portion of the protein that may require metal or not, and even just having the ground state with the metal or not, that would be a huge help in many biomolecules. And have you considered those systems that might be more prone to be static and maybe work out right away?
Yeah, not yet, but that's a really good idea. That's a really good idea. And I'll say that one step further is that although I think that predicting densities is sort of a killer app, so to speak, for Euclidean neural networks, there's nothing that is special about this particular application. Euclidean neural networks can be used for any three-dimensional data. And in theory, they should be more efficient than other techniques. So say you just wanted to predict the activity of a catalytic site based on its structure, you could use a Euclidean neural network to do that. And it wouldn't be ab initio based like this, it would be data based, which is fine given whatever application you want to use. But yeah, I think that Euclidean neural networks make a great sort of test bed for all of these structural prediction kind of tasks.
I see. So we have a question from Oliver Gordon, and then we will close after that.
Yeah, so my question is, so it seems like this performs well for the water molecules because it is a homogeneous system. And so, of course, I mean, you can have problems going to heterogeneous systems. Do you think it would be feasible that might be solved by modeling electron degrees of freedom instead of atomic degrees of freedom?
Can you expand on what you mean by modeling electronic degrees of freedom?
Yeah, so I assume that these are like point atoms with some fixed charge. So could you, I mean, model the electrons in, the central potential of the nucleus?
I see.
Then all of your elements are electrons, not different species of atoms.
So you're imagining a situation where each atom, instead of being a point, would sort of be a pro-atom. It would be kind of an isolated electronic structure. It wouldn't be the full solution, of course, but that isolated electronic structure would be the input as opposed to the point. Is that sort of a fair?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting idea. That gets to an area of machine learning that I'm not yet an expert in, which is sort of transfer learning. In other words, how do you go from a solution that's approximate to a solution that's exact? But yeah, that's a really interesting idea. The places I have thought about doing that is in the context of making the jump from DFT to higher level quantum calculations. So could you take as input a DFT calculation and predict the density or a wave function, if you wanted, of a higher level of theory? That would be a really interesting, you have much more information in that sense. You know, it would sort of be like the perturbation steps of a higher level wave function method. Yeah, a very interesting idea.
Well, so I'll thank again Josh for amazing talk and really exciting. And if anyone, you know, I think that you have the information if anyone is interested on following up. So thank you again for your contribution today.
I would like to thank our speaker, and also thank everybody for attending the colloquium, and have a nice weekend, everybody.
Nice to meet you all. Have a good weekend.
Bye.